with AP.
The broadcast is now starting. All attendees are in listen-only mode.
Good afternoon again, and thank you for joining your Hour with APA Virginia, sponsored by the Berkeley Group. Your Hour with APA Virginia is hosted on the fourth Monday of each month from noon to 1 p.m. We're going to give everyone a minute to log in and get settled. Thank you again for joining our webinar today. Before we get started, we want to remind you of a few exciting things APA Virginia has coming up and a couple of housekeeping items. Registration for APA Virginia's 50th conference is now live. Please visit apavirginia.com for more information, including our conference FAQ and ticket policy. And mark your calendars for the July webinar. July 27th from noon to 1 p.m. will bring you Transforming the Customer Experience, online plan review and permitting. More details to follow. As we do every month, this webinar, Look In Before You Lean In, will be recorded and posted to our YouTube page by the end of the day. We encourage you to visit our YouTube and see past webinars or share it with colleagues. Unlike our typical webinars, Look In Before You Lean In was previously scheduled as a workshop for the national conference in Houston. To make this webinar more interactive, we're taking questions as they come in, so please don't hesitate to ask as we go. Again, thank you to the Berkeley Group for making this webinar series possible. We're always looking for new webinar presenters or topics, so if you have one you would like us to look into, please email admin@apavirginia.com. This month's webinar, Look In Before You Lean In, is presented by three panelists. First up, we have Lorna Parkins, FAICP. Lorna Parkins has over 30 years of experience in planning, including both public sector and private sector positions. She is a skilled community planning facilitator. She has navigated her career, rising through a series of management roles to a prominent position in a large AE firm, while raising 4 children and engaging in a rich array of volunteer and professional activities. She has engaged young women as a mentor and guest speaker and found that the anxiety around work-family balance can be paralyzing. In response, she has developed a values-based approach to work-family balance using the principles of community planning facilitation. Next up, we have Catherine Ange, AICP. Catherine is president of Renaissance Planning, a small planning consulting firm. She has 19 years of experience in design, analysis, policy making, and engagement to promote sustainable communities. Kate thrives on fostering knowledge exchange and facilitating conversations that inspire action and lead to policy change. Based in Arlington, Virginia, she traveled extensively across the U.S. working with communities on transit-oriented development, multi-modal transportation, health, scenario planning, visioning, and comprehensive planning. She leads a full personal life as a spouse, mom of a teenager, owner of 2 dogs, daughter of 2 parents, and an avid reader and connoisseur of binge-worthy television. Next, we have Hannah Twaddell. Hannah has 32 years of experience in multi-modal transportation planning and policy development, with an emphasis on promoting sustainable, vibrant communities by integrating multi-modal transportation, land use, and urban design. Since 2001, she has served as a consultant planner, facilitator, and educator for local, state, and national agencies, following a 13-year tenure with the Regional Planning Commission in her home community of Charlottesville, Virginia. Through this time, Hannah has volunteered for the civic organizations, served as a church music director, and with her husband, raised a daughter for aging parents and maintained a farmhouse built by her grandfather. At this time, we will now transition to the presentation today.
All right, this is Lorna Parkins, and thank you for joining us. Sorry, it took me a minute to find the right place to unmute myself. So welcome. As Paige described, we want to take a moment out of your day today to talk about work-family balance planning. As she indicated in my bio, I've done work as a mentor in a number of different contexts where I've really noticed that there needs to be some confidence building in people at all stages of their professions, but especially going all the way back to like girls and young women who are thinking of their future careers, and also young professionals who haven't started their families yet, for example, who are just really fearful of how to navigate these decisions. And so this is designed as a workshop. So we're going to kind of lead you into some interactive components today, but because it's not literally a workshop and it's also just an hour, we'll move through that fairly quickly. But hopefully there will be an opportunity for dialogue and some ongoing work on this, on, you know, kind of as a homework assignment if you want to take it that way, if you're really interested in the approach. So if you go to the next slide, you know, the thing that I think can be paralyzing about looking out into the future and thinking about how to navigate work-family balance is you know, a lot of what we hear in society, that everyone seems to think, you know, either you can have it all or you can't have it all, or, you know, this is the right thing to do and this is the right path, when the reality is that every family has to decide the right path for them. It's a very personal, individual decision. And what I've found is that the framework that we use in planning to start with your values, translate your values into a vision, and then take action from there is exactly the right approach to figuring this out. So if you go to the next slide, you know, this is about sort of looking in to give you the guiding principles and the guiding path for those decisions. And I don't like to define it exactly in opposition to Sheryl Sandberg's Lean In, but you know, her book, if you've read it or if you've heard some of the key points from it, really talks about just embracing the challenges of your career and kind of moving headlong into that. And Hannah and Kate and I had dinner at a conference, I think it was almost 4 years ago now, where we were talking about this topic. And Kate kind of coined this phrase that you know, what I feel is the right thing for people to do is to look inward before you make those decisions about leaning in. And you may end up making a different decision than anyone else has made, and that's how you find your unique path. So hopefully in our webinar today, you'll hear stories from the three of us that illustrate how unique those paths may be and how different those paths may be, but also get some tools for navigating that yourself. So it starts with identifying your values, creating a vision, and taking action. If you go to the next slide. So just, you know, this is a planner audience, so this should be pretty straightforward, but it starts with reminding yourself, what is a value? Okay, so a value is something that is important to you, and it's a guiding force. You might think of it as your must-have items or your no-can-do items. I'm looking at my notes and I realized before I dive into that too far, there's one other thing I wanted to say. As Kate and Hannah and I tell our stories today, I want to acknowledge that, you know, we're all women, we're white, we're heterosexual, we all have kind of a certain framework that allows us to have some choices. And not everybody is privileged to be able to make all the choices that go with their values that we talk about today. And I just want to acknowledge that up front, that's an important issue to keep in mind. And we're in no way suggesting that as you look inward, you necessarily have all the choices that go with your preferences. But I do hope that we can encourage you, and I hope maybe when we get to our dialogue, talk about, even when your choices are limited, there are ways to let your values and your guiding principles bring you to ask questions and look for solutions that will still help you navigate more successfully through work-family balance. So that's an important acknowledgement I wanted to give before we dive all the way into this. But it's so. In keeping with that, you know, it still starts with your values. So again, so your values are the things that are important to you, that that really give your life its direction. And we don't always think about them every day. So we're going to spend some time talking about that. If you go to the next slide. So the way that I want to start this this webinar and this exercise is for everybody who's on the phone to think about your values. So we've given you a selection of words here, and I want you to think about pick three from the screen, and in a moment I'm going to go ahead and tell you what my three are, just to move the illustration forward. But Hannah, do you want to kind of help set the stage for how we look at values as we keep this slide up?
Thanks, Lorna. Yeah, when we were putting this together, the facilitator in me thought we need to frame this in various types of learning modes. So some people like me are intuitive off the scale, and this kind of exercise is super easy because we're like, oh, what leaps out at me? What are the words that resonate with me? You know, that this is probably something that you might find kind of fun and interesting. And for people that are more data-driven and logic-driven and process-driven, and all those things that I'm not very good at most of the time, this might just sort of look like, what? Why do you mean? How do I associate this with me? And so a couple of ways to think about this is picking out words that represent what gets you up in the morning. You know, why are you doing what you're doing? Not just your job, but the other things you do in your life. When you go to bed at night, what is it that sort of makes you think, I've had a good day because I got to do some of these things, or I got to embody some of this quality in what I was doing. So those are just a few ways to just sort of begin to think about what a value really is in the way in which we're using them for this conversation today. So Lorna, do you want to go on and tell your story?
Yeah. Okay, so hopefully you've picked three, or we can move on and you can keep thinking about that and work on coming up with about three values to work from. So go on to the next slide, and I'll illustrate kind of how this works. So these are my three words. So my first one is independence, and the second one is productivity or productive. And then the third one, if you want to bring that up, is stimulation. So independence is a very important characteristic for me. I value it tremendously. I have since I was a kid, and it has really shaped how I raised my own children. My husband shares that value, and so, you know, it's part of our parenting style. It's part of my management style as in the business environment. And I really value independence. I like to operate independently. I don't like a lot of, you know, hand holding in myself in my career. And then, you know, that's been important. And it's probably been one big reason why I have always stayed in the workforce. And these other two feed into that as well. So you see, I use Thomas the Tank Engine to illustrate my second value, and the reason is, I don't know if you have kids, you've encountered Thomas the Tank Engine, and his theme, boy, it just really strikes a chord with me that he just wants to be a useful engine, and that really describes me in a lot of ways. You know, I'm that person who's up by 7 o'clock on Saturday morning to go get stuff done before everybody else is up, and I just really focus, you know, my time management and my life management around feeling productive. That's important to me, and then stimulation is also really important to me. So again, I think all three of these fed into my decision to stay in the workforce throughout the time that I raised my family, and it allowed me to thrive with everything going on the home front, as well as keeping my career going. And so that's my set of values in brief. I'll circle back to that a little bit later, but now Hannah's going to tell her story even more in depth.
Great, thanks, Lorna. And I did want to reassure everybody that Kate is still with us. She clicked off her video because the internet feed was a little bit slow. Next slide, please, Paige. Thank you. So first, a few vocabulary words for the day. The word job dates back to about 1550 from the Middle English word jobben, I didn't know this until I looked it up, meaning lump or mass, which is rather a depressing way to think about your work, but it's basically an activity that's performed in exchange for contracted compensation. You get paid for it usually. Whereas work is a concept that came along about 100 years later. And it really is more about something that is done or completed. It's something about an accomplishment or something you produce with or without compensation. And so I love this picture of the Sistine Chapel on the right. It made me think about this. So Michelangelo did in fact get paid to paint that ceiling by Pope Julius II. And several centuries before that, people were paid to dig the stones out of the quarry and build the structure and so forth. So all those people had jobs associated with this amazing piece of art and architecture, but they also contributed toward a work. This was a body of work, this building. So when you think about that in terms of the work that we do, most of us on the call, we might be paid to do jobs like write conservation ordinances and review site plans and all those tasks that contribute to the work, and this is the work, of creating really beautiful, sustainable communities where people live for generations after our jobs are done. And most of us also do other jobs and tasks for which we're not paid, but those also contribute to that larger work of community building. Next slide, please, Paige. So thinking about balance, right? Work-life balance, job balance. Every few years, personally, I like to take a personal development course or a session with a career coach, something like this webinar, something that helps me examine whether what I'm doing in my work and my personal life are aligning with my values. And pretty much every time I come up with the same core answers, like the one on the left, which is that I'm never balanced. This just never happens at any given moment. When it comes to dedicating time and energy to all of the important parts of my life, right? My professional work is just one of the pins on the wheel. There's family, there's physical health, there's spiritual well-being, there's community work, all of those things. It's not realistic to expect that wheel to be perfect ever. But if I can get some energy into each of those realms at some point throughout the week or the month or the year, the balance can be achieved over time. So it's just something to sort of soothe me, because whenever I do these, I always think I'm failing in some way, but you're really not. There's balance happening, but balance happens while you're doing it, like riding a bike, right? Secondly, my values really come down to learning and love. So I should explain that to me, the word love means the life force that sustains our being in this universe. I know I sound like Obi-Wan Kenobi when I say that, but it's true. It's a gift. It's a gift I don't deserve. It's not something I really have the power to create, but it is something I can pass on and give to others. And I like learning because it's fun. It's just fun. I feel like I'm making good use of my time on this earth when I'm either feeding my hungry mind with new insights, or I'm serving as a vessel to pour love into the world around me, especially when I get to do these things simultaneously. So at a professional context, that might be learning, might be professional research. In a personal context, it might be deepening spiritual awareness or mastering a piece of music. Whereas love might be pushing me to pay closer attention to the people that are in a workshop that are talking about the needs for their community. Or it might be something that makes me stay up until 2 in the morning to console an anxious friend. Next slide. So I thought about my own story in the periods of decades, 20s, 30s, 40s, and beyond. In my early 20s, my first priorities in adult life were not so much about finding a fulfilling career as they were about establishing a strong relationship with my husband, and that involved settling with him in the family's farmhouse here in Charlottesville to enable another generation to live here. So that initial life choice meant that my job and my career choices were predicated on living in this community. And I had a master's degree in teaching, but I soon discovered that landing a living wage teaching job in a small college town full of people with PhDs was a little difficult for someone with virtually no experience. So after a couple of years of seeking and failing to land that kind of job, I got some valuable advice from a friend. to shift my search away from the job title and toward the activities and qualities of the work. Is this something I could do well and enjoy doing regardless of the title? Once I did that, I really freed myself from the torture of trying to fit myself into a narrowly defined job title, and I started a lifelong practice of writing the book instead of designing the cover. So after that shift, I accidentally started a 14-year career in planning at the Thomas Jefferson Planning District Commission. And it was accidental in a way because I just had three reasons. One, I needed a solid job that would sustain my family. Two, I was good at and I enjoyed the kinds of things that the job required, even though I wasn't formally trained for it. And three, I admired and I wanted to work for the amazing director of the agency. And I found that I liked that creative challenge of figuring out the job as I went. So that gave me this sort of lifelong attitude of Zen mind, beginner's mind. It helps me avoid that arrogance that comes along with some level of experience, thinking I might know more than there is to know about any topic. I always feel like I'm starting new pretty much every day. Next slide. So as I got into my 30s, after about 9 years of deliberating with my husband about whether or not to have children, we decided to go ahead and try. And I realized as this was occurring and this deliberation was going on that I was actually unconsciously really afraid to have children because I assumed it meant I would have to stop working. That's pretty much a factor of the years in which I was a child and grew up and the culture that spoke to me. But I really believed I was supposed to simultaneously be a domestic goddess and a breadwinner. And as it turns out, I wasn't really alone in this conundrum. Once I actually started trying to get pregnant, I actually spent 3 years struggling with infertility that was related to endometriosis. And Christiane Northrup, who wrote a really interesting book in that era, called that particular condition, endometriosis, the disease of competition, because she observed that so many of her patients with it also had successful careers and felt very conflicted about the idea of starting a family. It was a really interesting thing to learn. And thankfully, by the time I did have my baby, Marion, who's now a 22-year-old baby, my husband actually wanted to change his career direction. He needed some time to work through that. So it actually made sense for him to stay home with the baby. And he was so much better at it than I ever would have been. He's quiet, she's quiet. She would have been driven crazy with me trying to be busy all the time. He's a much better cook than I am. And we were just able to make it work financially, in part because of the gift of a home that was provided by his family, but also the money we saved on daycare and all those crazy things you do trying to be, two-income parents. And the Planning District Commission was very supportive. Again, I really appreciated my workplace. Next slide. So moving into my 40s. After about 15 years in the public sector, I decided to take a leap of faith and try a shift to consulting with Renaissance Planning, with the firm that Kate now leads. And for the first several years, I tried not to let on how much I loved my family because I was afraid it would be seen as unprofessional in an industry that was largely led by men who were not heavily involved in child raising and who hardly ever talked about their kids. So I felt I should appear less traditionally feminine, less emotionally demonstrative, very careful about revealing any uncertainty or lack of knowledge, even though I was in a totally new professional setting and I had a lot to learn. But in short, I thought I should hide my natural predisposition towards sort of childlike affection and naive curiosity and display some persona of cool competence. Full disclosure, Kate and Lorna knew me through this period of time and knew that I was fooling no one. They don't believe that, but it's true. I did love the work, but I got increasingly exhausted by my own self-imposed requirement to divide my attention and compartmentalize my life into separate realms of work and family, and to try to squeeze my big personality into a narrow persona or my broad hips into a pencil skirt. That never worked on me. So while my husband's aging parents came to live next door to us, that's when I hit the end of my ability to keep trying to segment my time and my attention into work versus family. By that time, my husband had returned to full-time work. Our daughter was a little more independent. He was pretty involved in raising her and came to all the parent-teacher conferences, but when the need arose to extend more loving care to his parents, it was my turn to step up. And I tried for quite a while to just keep working at the same pace, which meant I found myself doing things like hauling my laptop into hospital waiting rooms. But my performance at work slipped farther and farther as my energy ran down. My heart just wasn't in it anymore. And it became clear that it just didn't make financial sense for the firm I was working for to keep paying me when I couldn't contribute my best efforts towards growing it. Renaissance was incredibly supportive, provided a lot of resources to me to build a body of work as a solo practitioner, which I was able to sustain while caring for aging parents and raising a daughter through adolescence. So again, I'll always be grateful for the support of that employer during this difficult time in my life. And while those years were difficult, they were also wonderful. Caregiving is not my natural forte. I've known that since I was 18, and I flunked out of my first summer job as a nurse's aide. But I was lucky enough to have a really loving relationship with my parents-in-law, and I've never regretted investing that time and energy at that point in my life to pay them back in some small measure for all the love and support they freely gave us. Next slide, and the last one. So about 7 years ago now, into my 50s, I was offered an opportunity to work for ICF, the company I'm with now, and the timing was perfect. My daughter was growing a little more independent. I had just finished settling my in-laws' estate after they both passed away. And the company was fine with me working remotely and traveling up to DC every once in a while. So this job has given me a chance to tackle new intellectual challenges, build relationships with a wide variety of planners and policymakers all over the country and even the world. In short, I get to learn new things and make new friends, same values I've always had. And I no longer feel quite so concerned about trying to separate my work and my family life in reality or in appearance. I'm the same person with the same values and gifts, whether I'm facilitating a community workshop or leading hymns at church or hiking with my husband and daughter. And it's often fascinating and useful to apply the insights and experiences I have within personal and spiritual settings to my professional work. For instance, right now, I'm drawing upon my personal growth and my emotional turmoil about systemic racism in our country to improve the depth and quality of my research and my policy work on addressing environmental justice and transportation planning. In retrospect, I've observed that the most successful accomplishments of my professional work, whether I'm paid for it or not, almost always stem from leaning into my personal values and my natural affinities for learning and for loving. Let's move on to Kate.
It actually goes back to me.
Oh, let's go back to Lauren.
Yeah, thank you so much, Hannah. That was fabulous. So Hannah just really beautifully illustrated, what we're talking about here, that you're going to come to many forks in the road in your life and your career and your family choices. And so I want to spend the next part of the webinar just talking about how those trade-offs are difficult to navigate because of the unknowns, right? There are things that you may not realize you're going to have to contend with. And I just want to say that everyone is having just an amazing experiment right now in testing, in like test marketing all of the trade-offs at once, right? Because we've had some things thrust upon us unexpectedly in the realms of both work and family balance and juggling. So normally when I've given this talk in the past, I'm still speaking in the abstract about a lot of these things, but actually many of you on the webinar have had a chance to try out some different things. And so we're going to talk about how that will help you making choices in the future. So I'm going to quickly move through the next series of slides just to illustrate that understanding what those trade-offs will be, and you can do some research and talk to people to find out. That's really at the core of making sure that you make your choices in alignment with your values. So one choice, for example, may be staying home for a period of time, and that works for you if what is important to you is that you're going to be there for it all, and you can create a consistent environment, and you can create more simplicity in your life in terms of having a limited number of jobs that you're more fully focused on. There's still many jobs. I'm not saying it's fewer jobs, but you get to have that focus. So you'll see in these slides, the green things are kind of the positives, and then the gray things are more negative. So some of the challenges, the negative side of the trade-off equation is you don't have as many backup systems in place when you stay at home. The division of labor is more distinct, but that means there's less connecting between different jobs in your household. There could be a lack of adult stimulation, and everyone nowadays seems to think, oh, if you stay at home, well, you're the one who can do all the volunteer things, and that really can spiral out of control. So the next example or typology, if you want to use planning lingo, is trying to stay at home but also work. Well, I guess everyone's getting to try this out right now, right? So if you're raising children, some of the positives are that you're there for it all. You don't miss their first step or their first word, but the tag teaming is intense, right? And it can give you that balance of income without daycare if you can pull that off. And that seems to work well, especially for people who are working independently, particularly in more artistic pursuits. But some of the negatives are lack of boundaries and extreme multitasking, which really kind of requires you to have more structure to make this work. And so that could be challenging if the reason you're doing it is because you're an artist or a writer or something to begin with. That may not be your strong suit. So the lack of boundaries is challenging. And then also mistaken identity. Because you're home, people think you're not working when you are actually committed to certain deadlines and work. So those are some of the challenges to that model. And I'm sure you all could add quite a few given your current experiences. And then the next example that I wanted to put out there is staying in the workforce, but applying the brakes. So this is personal to me. This is how I would describe what I did. And that is kind of grabbing the throttle on your career and controlling it. So you're in the workforce, but maybe you work reduced hours. You have the ability to turn down assignments, or you take that risk, honestly, of saying no to some things. I worked many years for, quote, 35 hours a week, unquote, just basically to be able to say no to things and to have some flexibility in my daytime schedule. Now you will still, this gets you over into the column of, working outside the home. You will miss some things. You're going to have to be really good at asking for what you need, and you have to be willing to hold back on your career, which is challenging. I hope you'll hear in some of our stories, and I think we heard in Hannah's story that, there are future choices ahead of you that will help you rebalance later in your life. And so being willing to hold back on some things early in your career, or whenever it is in your career that you need to make those balance choices, it can scare you, but there's maybe some hope that your career is long and has many opportunities in it. And then the last example is really the fully staying in the workforce and leaning in. And this brings uninterrupted advancement, benefits and retirement. And for people who don't have an array of financial support, like a home that was given to them by their in-laws in Hannah's case, or a spouse who's bringing in income, or other forms of support, this may not be a choice. So I want to acknowledge that that's, some people have to work within this model. But here, the really important thing is building a village. And so Kate's going to walk us through some her story and talk about this lean in example.
All right, well, thank you, Lorna. Can everyone hear me okay? Okay, excellent. Go to the next slide. So I'm going to start this discussion with a video for just a quick moment. This is an advertisement circa 1982 that was on television all the time. Go ahead, Paige. Oh, we're not hearing the sound today. Well, if you don't recognize it, let me tell you what the words are. It basically says, I can bring home the bacon, I can fry it up in a pan, and I can never let you forget you're a man. And that song, as I was growing up, was one of those, earworm songs. And it really represented at that kind of snapshot in time that there was a big push for women to do it all. So not only kind of bring home the bacon, but still be the caretaker. And oh, by the way, also have a great relationship and have all of those things. So I came of age in an era where I do think there was a big push that you can do it all. But on top of that, I certainly felt that not only could I do it, but I must do it for a whole host of reasons. So what I think is interesting about this is I don't think I intentionally sat down and ever figured out what my values were until probably later in life. But if I look back and I really evaluate why have I made the choices I've made, it is because of some core values. And that had to do with independence, wanting my own financial security, insatiable curiosity, that love of learning, and also just wanting to do good in the world. What I grew up underneath was a divorced mom who was also a very strong professional, was kind of a boss. I was a Generation X latchkey kid. So these were things that just seemed very normal to me to kind of lean in at a very early age. So I started my career with a whole lot of kind of foundational things that I would say the lean in model was all I really knew and all I really thought I had in terms of a choice. If we go to the next slide, what that led me to in terms of my kind of professional career is that I just, through my 20s, leaned as far in as I could. I was working full time. I also went back and got my master's while working full time. And I found that this juggling act, I was kind of good at it. And what's interesting about the juggling is what I've now kind of also realized a value is for me is that if it's not hard, it's not rewarding. So I've kind of figured that out about myself. So the ability to be doing many things and to do many things that are difficult, when I can pull that off, it feels good and it kind of strokes the ego. As I made it through my 20s though, and was able to advance from professionally, was able to get married, was able to do a lot of great things in terms of go back to school. I think as we started to think about having a child, I also thought, well, that'll be just another ball to juggle, and I got this. It'll be no problem. And so I went into motherhood with very, I'm not going to say cavalier, but pretty strong confidence that I could handle it. Simply because, again, I had a past role model in my own mother seeing it, and also just had the ability to juggle quite a bit in my 20s. If we go to the next slide. But what happened, I became a mom at age 30, and I immediately went back to work at about 10 weeks. And very soon after that, I tell this story, my husband and I at the time, I think we were in a little bit of shell shock and not really thinking clearly, because we both looked at each other and said, you know what? We can't do this alone. We don't have a village. There's no way we can both have professional careers and try to do this by ourselves. So within 3 months of my daughter's birth, we picked up, both got new jobs, moved back to our hometown, and started our lives there. And what was wonderful about that is I knew that I didn't want to give up my professional career, but I really needed that village. And so we were super fortunate to be able to move back home and have both sides of our family for the first 5 years of my daughter's life. And that was amazing. She got to develop those relationships. We always had backup. And so it was a really positive time. All that said, it was still a challenge. And I would say for the first 5 years, that juggling was difficult because I was traveling. There were a lot of things that, that juggling got harder and harder for me. But I will say that I was very intentional in the good news is I had that village, my family, extended friends, that sort of thing. And it really gave me the foundation to kind of continue to advance my career, but also feel like my daughter had a great network of love surrounding her and good guidance and those sorts of things. If we go to the next slide, I think what's interesting about where the next phase of my life took me is once my daughter was old enough, I was feeling strong in my own professional career and kind of had my sea legs as a parent. So when she was about to start kindergarten, we decided to move back to the city, which is Arlington area again, and start anew. And so my husband and I both were able to do that. And I would say career-wise, definitely continued to accelerate for the next 10 years. And I would say in the last 5 years, I think it has been that I took over as president of Renaissance. So my career has been great. My daughter and my husband, I think, have thrived under these conditions. But one of the big takeaways that I think has been my biggest lesson learned is that I have not done that self-value check-in as often as maybe Hannah suggests that we all do, because it really does require you to know thyself. And when I really look back and kind of reassess what is it that I need and what are the things that bring me balance, it is kind of getting back to, well, gosh, you know, those cultural cues and the way I was raised really said there was only one path for me, which was to only lean in. What I'm now realizing, coming up at a very midlife point in my time, is that there are multiple paths, and there are multiple paths at different phases of life. And so the good news is, I think what's been so wonderful about this pandemic, I hate to say that in one sentence, but many of us are seeing the human side of our colleagues and our friends, in terms of we are all trying to kind of keep working while also having kids behind us, being teachers. And there's been this really unique, I would say, moment where we're all experiencing something that is out of our control. And what I really enjoy seeing is that every single person in our company has another life outside of the company, and that life under the pandemic is challenging. And so what I see, and the good news that I've seen in the 2 decades that I've been a professional, is that at least on the workforce side of things, I believe we are creating workplaces that allow for a whole broader spectrum of how you want to engage. Specifically, you know, Lorna laid out all of those options. And I just remember being a young buck in my 20s and kind of, you know, it was either lean in or you were out. And that's not the case anymore. You can successfully, I would say, grow your career, be kind of at the top of your game, you know, at different phases, and also put on those brakes, also take a few years off, also have a, you know, significant visible role in an organization while still trying to maybe only work 32 hours a week. So I think there is a broader acceptance growing in the work world, and I feel like this moment in time is only going to continue to push us further. So I guess, you know, my takeaways in terms of, you know, any advice I can give as the lean in example here is just really pause every now and then and make sure you really know yourself in terms of what your values are, what gets you excited to get up in the morning. Maybe you're a master juggler. Maybe you like that just like I do, but maybe not. Maybe chaos is not your happy place. So stop every now and then and ask those questions. And I think it's a really helpful exercise because you can adjust. And I think the good news is I feel like the workplace, there is a place for every model, and it's only getting stronger. So with that, I'll turn it back over to Lorna.
Thank you, Kate. What a great illustration of our themes, and what a great story. Thank you. So I'm just going to say a few more things about my path just to illustrate you know, some of these key points, and then we'll get to the discussion in just a few minutes. So I would characterize myself as a plate spinner, not exactly a juggler, because you have to keep all the balls in the air juggling while you're on the unicycle. A plate spinner's getting everything just far enough along that it keeps moving. And why this illustration works well for me, if you go back to my values, it's very stimulating. You're, you know, high adrenaline, right? To keep all the plates moving. And it also is very productive. You know, it keeps everything moving along just so. And I'm the one spinning the plates, you know, that feeds the independence as well. But another aspect of this, coming back to those trade-offs, is you have to be willing for things to not be perfect. And there's, you know, there's a real trade-off in doing more things at once. And it contrasts well with my best friend from childhood, who she went to Wellesley College, Harvard Law School, and has had a very successful legal career. She waited to have her kids after she made partner, and then she left her career entirely, because the way she's wired and the way her values work, she does excellent work, but she wants to focus on a certain number of things at a time. And it's been really kind of fun and interesting for us to stay connected, being, you know, on very different paths as far as that goes, but you know, but still having that understanding and appreciation that each of us is moving forward based on our values. And that's so important. We can't defend ourselves by tearing other people down in their choices. As Kate was saying, you know, we're at this wonderful moment in time, despite the circumstances, where a tremendous amount of flexibility is being created just to handle the things that are outside of our control through this pandemic. And those are the silver linings that we have to grab onto. So if you go to the next slide, a lot of it does come back to what Kate said about chaos. When you understand those trade-offs and you understand how much structure you need, you know, these are the moments we're all having at home right now, right? This is my dog with his head in the Cheez-It box, where, you know, things are just a little bit past where we'd like them to be in terms of our level of structure and control, but we can learn from that. You know, what is it that works for us and what doesn't? And, you know, another way of looking at it is the old drinking from the fire hose analogy. Everybody's been thrust into that situation of drinking from the fire hose, doing all the jobs, wearing all the hats these last few months. But if we go back and look at our values and root ourselves in what is really important to us, we can, and now that we've had this big experiment, we can start to see what does work for us, what doesn't work for us. And then the most important thing you have to do is ask. Ask for what you need. So one of the key inflection points in my career was after I had my fourth child. I'd been with that particular company. I was in the private sector, and I'd been with that company for about 3 years. When I first went to that company, I was also having my third child, but I had to keep full-time hours. I had to come back, you know, after the minimum maternity leave. But when I had my fourth child a couple years later, I asked for more flexibility, and I had kind of earned their respect in the, you know, the value that I brought to my job. And my situation was that I wanted to have a nanny, but I tried that for 2 weeks. And I realized I needed somebody to be watching the person watching my children. And that goes back to bad stuff from my own childhood that just, you know, it really deeply ingrained in me that I want someone watching the person watching my child. And I also learned that my oldest needed too much stimulation, and he was driving the nanny crazy, getting into trouble. And also I learned that my next oldest child, she really needed more time with me. When I had been home on maternity leave and then left, that was really hard on her. So we came up with this balance that worked. I asked if I could be in the office 3 days a week and then work 6 more hours at home, which got me to 30 hours, which kicked in my benefits. And so I got to tell you, you know, my take-home pay after all, you know, childcare and everything wasn't a whole lot, but I was contributing those benefits. I was contributing to my retirement. I was keeping my career going. It was a unique balance. It was a very plate spinning kind of balance. But it was just right for us at that time, me and my family, my kids, my husband. It worked really well. But I had to ask for that accommodation. It was a unique situation, and they trusted me because they knew me at that point and they knew my value to the company. So I hope that is an illustration of the fact that when you really touch base with your values, you can come up with that vision and then see how you can work towards that. Sometimes you can just ask your employer. Sometimes that's not the answer. You don't have that choice. So you might have to think about changing jobs or getting some different education or making a pivot the way that particularly Hannah talked about early in her career. So with that, let's go to the next slide. So the next part of the workshop is really to go back to those values that you identified early on and start thinking about how in the past or the present or in the future your choices were or could be shaped by your values. And again, the experiment that we're all living through right now is a great framework for evaluating what does and doesn't work for you. And thinking through, as Kate was saying, thinking through how you have made choices about trade-offs and connecting that to your values helps, you know, create that resonance for this method and gives you some confidence that it can work for you in the future. So we're not in a workshop, but we thought, you know, that if you see people you know in the list of attendees today and you want to reach out to create a buddy to work through the exercise with, feel free. And of course, you can reach out to one of us. And then one thing I didn't mention is more of my story in this framework is in a blog that I wrote several years ago. It's got 6 components, and I've got the address to that at the end on the final slide. slide, but that gives a little bit more of the background. But really, the next move is to take action, to check in with your values, see how they can guide your choices, and see where you're going next. So with that, we're ready for some discussion. We've got about 10 minutes left, and we can take some questions from the chat box. And here's our contact information and the blog address, as I mentioned. So Paige,
Hey, Lorna,
Mhm.
can I just add one more thing too?
Sure.
So just for everybody's benefit, I think one of the things that all three of us probably maybe mentioned subtly, but is a big part of maybe our experience, is the fact that there are a lot of trade-offs, which means there are a lot of things that maybe didn't go right, or are continue to be struggles. And so I don't want to leave anyone with the impression that we've got it all figured out, because I do feel like at each phase we are all reassessing. And I think if the biggest takeaway here is just the fact that doing this values exercise, doing that check-in on a regular basis can help you to continue to pivot and reassess, and then possibly realign your professional career to better align with those values that you hold dear and the personal life that you also hold dear. So I just wanted to say that, because I was looking back over my notes thinking, well, that sounded all too perfect, and it's definitely not. So.
Well, right. And to me, the goal, as I stated at the top of the webinar, is to help people have confidence to take risks, because you're going to be able to figure it out. Go ahead and start your family if everything except your boss is making you feel like this is the right time and that's the right thing to do. I've literally talked with women who were frozen up over that decision. And when I say women, I know it's women and men, and it's parenting issues that we're talking about. And so this is designed to empower you to know that society can't tell you the right thing to do. You can do it, and and things will change, and you can do it again. So thank you for that, Kate. All right, so Paige, we're ready to see if anybody has offered a question or an observation in the chat that someone would like to share.
Yes, I have a response to something previous in the webinar from Elaine. She says her three words are feelings of satisfaction, items complete, and happiness.
Great. Yeah,
And
thank you for sharing that. Yeah.
we have another question here. It says, thank you, Lorna, Kate, and Hannah, for sharing your stories of honesty, for sharing your stories honestly and openly. Sorry. One of the fears people who are thinking about leaving the workforce entirely for a period of time is that they will not be able to re-enter years later. Lorna, your friend who made partner and then left entirely, what was her experience when she decided to re-enter?
Yeah, so I'm glad you raised that, because one of the things that I wanted to mention you can do on that track is you can still stay involved in professional organizations, and that's what she's done. So she stayed in touch with her profession through professional organizations, because that networking can continue regardless of whether you're still in the workforce. And she's actually still deciding what to do, but she's at a point of thinking about more of a nonprofit or a volunteer capacity. Her husband is also an attorney, so she has fortunate to have a lot of choices, from a financial perspective. But in terms of coming back, she has used her volunteer engagement while out of the workforce to stay connected and to create those networks and those opportunities to have some good choices coming back in.
We have another question here. It says, thank you for this lovely panel. I was wondering if you could speak a little more about what exact levels and position you guys came back to before and after children.
Mm-hmm. Yeah, so for me, I got promoted each time I came back from maternity leave the first 2 times that I was out. And so I don't know that that's an ordinary occurrence, but I do think that I was with the same employer, and part of it was recognizing that I my contributions were significant, and they knew that I didn't necessarily want, because I had reduced hours, but they gave me a promotion anyway. So I became a project manager after my first child. I became kind of a higher level sort of deputy executive director after my second child. Then I moved to the private sector, looking for even more flexibility, and then it was after my fourth child that I became a department manager. So I was able to keep moving up in tandem with having kids, and it just, it comes back to building confidence in your ability to get things done and add value. I think the value you add is really the root of how those occur. But I'm sure that's not everyone's story. So Hannah and Kate, do you want to answer that one as well?
Sure. So similar to you, Lorna, I think in the period of life where I was deciding to have a child and working through that, I had already been with my employer at the Planning District Commission for a good, 8 or 9 years or something. So I had a lot of leave time built up. I could take 3 months off with the leave I had. And I kind of was able to put things in place and then come back to them and mentally not totally check out and all of that. That was a helpful thing to have a long-term job that I was familiar with. When I went through the caring for aging parents pullback again, I was pretty long into consulting and at least had enough experience with that and enough buildup of contacts and networks to be able to, kind of pivot to having my own practice, which sounds really scary and hard. And actually I found it pretty easy, mostly because people like Kate were really supportive and helpful with a lot of advice and resources. But that, I promoted myself to president of my own company, and I hired my dog, and it worked out great. So yeah, I think like Lorna says, it's a little bit about your relationship to the company you're working for, but also your broader relationship to your colleagues and your investment in the larger work that you're doing that sometimes will sort of propel you through. But I certainly never felt like I dropped backwards, dropped out and had to come back in. I kind of stayed engaged perpetually.
And as I mentioned earlier, I did make a lateral move when I had my third child from public sector to private sector, and I had a lot to learn. So that was an example of kind of pulling back on the throttle for a while. Go ahead, Kate.
No, I was just going to say I left for maternity leave as a project manager, and then I just decided, well, why not start a new job as a project manager? So it was a bit of a lateral move at the time, but it ended up being actually a pretty strong trajectory of further elevation once I joined Renaissance Planning. So my lean-in tendencies did not slow down when I went right back.
Thanks. Thanks, Paige.
We have a comment from Missy. It says, I appreciate the candid discussion. It is very important to have that balance in life. And then we have another question here. If you all have time to take another question, we have a few more left, so I might have to share that after we end the webinar. But the question right here says, thank you all for sharing your honest stories, success, and challenges. Any thoughts on the balance between finances, dual careers, and educating your children from home?
Yeah, and I didn't really tackle the financial part of the decisions here, but that, especially as your values may vary, it is important. And I said one quick word about, there were times in my career where I didn't seem like I was adding much to the bottom line, and families in the same situation may have chosen for one parent to stay home instead, and things probably would have worked out similarly. But you have to look at the whole picture, including benefits, including retirement savings. And the fact that I stayed in the workforce also, I think, helped stoke that future trajectory of my career. but you know, you can also just make a break and come back later, and you're learning skills and you're maturing in your management skills in ways that will still add dividends when you do come back. So that is a very unique thing. I do talk a little bit more about that in my blog, but I think that's an important topic for every family to include in that values conversation.
Okay, well, the time now is 1 o'clock, so we're going to go ahead and just say thank you again to our panelists and thank you again to our attendees. Any remaining questions, I will have our panel members answer them and I will send them to you directly for your answer. Again, thank you for all those who joined us today, and we will post this webinar as we do with the rest of our webinars to our YouTube by the end of today. Thank you again.
Thank you.
Thank you.